Perception. Chapter Overview of Psychological life begins with the activity of knowing what is happening around us. Sensation and perception are the first important dimensions of this intelligent life. They are starting points for all of our other psychological processes. You learning and remembering, you thinking and problem solving, you communicating with others, and you experiencing emotions and you being aware of yourself. Without access to the environment through sensation and perception, we would be like a person in a coma, devoid of any thoughts or feelings. The meanings of sensation and perception. Psychologists have traditionally differentiated between sensation and perception. Sensation is the process whereby stimulation of receptor cells in the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and surface of the skin sends nerve impulses to the brain. Sensations are closely tied to what is happening in the sensory systems themselves. The meanings of sensation and perception: color, brightness, the pitch of tone or a bitter taste are examples of sensations. The starting of point of sensations is a stimulus, a form of energy, such as light waves or sound waves, that can affect sensory organs, such as the eye or the ear. Sensation is therefore the process that detects the stimulus from one's body or from the environment. How different is sensation from perception? More than sensations, perceptual processes are constantly at work to modify sensory input into what are actually experiences. Perception is the process that organizes sensations into meaningful patterns. It is the process whereby the brain interprets sensations, giving them order and meaning. Thus, hearing sounds and seeing colors is largely a sensory process, but forming a melody and detecting patterns and shapes is largely a perceptual process. The sensory laws, sensory thresholds and sensory adaptation. There are certain sensory laws that explain how sensation works. Sensory threshold and sensory adaptation are the two general laws of sensation. Sensory threshold is the minimum point of intensity a sound can be detected. There are two laws of sensory threshold, the law of absolute threshold and the law of difference threshold. The absolute threshold, the minimum amount of stimulation a person can detect, is called the absolute threshold. The difference threshold. In addition to detecting the presence of a stimulus, you also detect changes in the intensity of a stimulus. The minimum amount of change that can be detected is called difference threshold. For example, a cup of coffee would require a certain amount of additional sugar before you could detect an increase in its sweetness. Similarly, you would have to increase the intensity of the sound from your tape recorder a certain amount before you could detect a change in its volume. Like the absolute threshold, the difference threshold for a particular sensory experience varies from person to person and from occasion to occasion. Sensory adaptation: if a stimulus remains constant in intensity, you will gradually stop noticing it. For example, after diving into a swimming pool, you might shiver. Yet a few minutes later you might invite someone to join you saying, "The water is fine." Sensory adaptation lets you detect potentially important change in your environment while ignoring unchanging aspects of it. Sensory adaptation equals habituation, is the tendency to ignore a stimulus that occurs continuously in the same way. Habituation is the decrease in response to a stimulus that occurs after repeated presentations of the same stimulus. Perception. Since we have its meaning before, let us see its procedures. Selectivity of perception, from perception, depth. Perception, perceptual constancy, and perceptual illusion. Selectivity of perception, attention. Any given time, your sense organ is bombarded by many stimuli, yet you perceive a few of them. Attention is therefore the term given to the perceptual process that selects certain inputs for inclusion in your conscious experience, or awareness, at any given time, ignoring others. What does this selectivity of perception imply? The selectivity of perception implies, among other things, that our field of experience is divided into what is known as focus and margin. Events or stimuli that you perceive clearly are the focus of your experience, and other items or stimuli that you perceive dimly or vaguely are in the margin of your attention. You may be aware of items in the marginal field but only vaguely or partially. Paying attention is in general a function of two factors, factors external to the perceiver and factors internal to the perceiver. External factors refer to factors that are generally found in the objects or stimuli to be perceived. Some of the external characteristics of objects that determine whether you are going to attend them or not are size and intensity, repetition, novelty or newness, and movement. Repetition is the second factor. You are more likely to attend to stimuli that repeatedly or frequently occur in your perceptual field. A misspelled word is more likely to be detected if it occurs many times in a paragraph than when it occurs only once or twice. Orptition is, then, attention getting that is, by the way, why slogans, advertisings, and announcement are repeated continuously to audience and spectators. Other external factor in attention getting is movement. Moving objects tend to get your attention more than non-moving or stagnant objects. Psychological factors to attention. Psychologists have identified two important psychological factors, set or expectancy, and motives or needs. Set refers to the idea that you may be ready and primed for certain kinds of sensory input. Set, or expectancy, therefore, varies from person to person. Motives and needs are the second psychological factors influencing you as an observer. There are differences between you and your friend in what you select to perceive as a result of differences in your motives and needs. You and your friend attend to and organize the sensory input in ways that match your respective needs. People who are hungry, thirst, or sexually aroused are likely to pay attention to events in the environment, which will satisfy these needs. From perception, sensations provide the raw materials that are to be organized into meaningful patterns, shapes, forms, and concepts or ideas or form perception. The meaningful shapes or patterns or ideas that are made out of meaningless sensations refer to form perception. To perceive forms, meaningful shapes or patterns, need to distinguish a figure, an object, from its ground, or its surrounding. Figure ground perception. Figure ground perception is the perception of objects and forms of everyday experience as standing out from a background. The ability to distinguish an object from its general background is basic to all form perception. And Gestalt psychologists stress that form perception in an active, rather than a passive, process like selectivity of perception. Contours in form perception. You are able to separate forms from the general ground only because you can perceive contours. Contours are formed whenever a marked difference occurs in the brightness or color of the background. For instance, if you look at a piece of paper that varies continuously in brightness from white at one border to black at the opposite border, you will perceive no contour. In perceiving the division at the place where the brightness gradient changes abruptly, you have perceived a contour. In general, contours give shape to the objects in our visual world because they mark one object off from another, or they mark an object off from the general ground. Organization in form perception. When several objects are present in the visual field, we tend to perceive them as organized into patterns or groupings. The Gestalt psychologists studied such organization intensively in the early part of this century. They emphasized that organized perceptual experience has properties, which cannot be predicated from a simple analysis of the components. In other words, Gestalt psychologists said the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Organization in perception partially explains our perception of complex patterns as unitary forms, or objects. Laws of perceptual organization. 1. Proximity or nearness. The laws of proximity says that items which are close together in space or time tend to be perceived as belonging together or forming an organized group. 2. Similarity. Most people see one triangle formed by the dots with its apex at the top and another triangle formed by the rings with its apex at the bottom. They perceive triangle because similar items such as the rings and the dots tend to be organized together. 3. Continuation. The tendency to perceive a line that starts in one way as continuing in the same way. Depth perception. If we live in a two-dimensional world, form perception would be sufficient. But because we live in a three-dimensional world, we have evolved depth perception, the ability to judge the distance of objects. Depth perception is the ability to view the world in 3 dimensions and to perceive distance. Given that images on the retina are two-dimensional, how can we perceive depth? Depth perception depends on the use of binocular cues and monocular cues. There are 2 kinds of binocular cues, retinal disparity and convergence. The 2 kinds of binocular cues require the interaction of both eyes. Explanation. The ability to view the world in 3 dimensions and to perceive distance, a skill known as depth perception, is due largely to the fact that we have 2 eyes. Because there is a certain distance between the eyes, a slightly different image reaches each retina. The brain integrates the 2 images into one composite view, but it also recognizes the difference in images and uses it to estimate the distance of an object from us. The difference in the images seen by the left eye and the right eye is known as binocular disparity. Retinal disparity is the degree of difference between the image of an object that are focused on the 2 retinas. The closer the object, the greater is the retinal disparity. The second binocular cue to depth is convergence, the degree to which the eyes turn inward to focus on an object. Hold a forefinger vertically in front of your face and move it toward your nose. Binocular cues require 2 eyes, whereas monocular cues require only 1. This means that even people who have lost sight in one eye may still have good depth perception. 1. Monocular is accommodation, which is the change in the shape of the lens that lets you focus the image of an object on the retina. Chapter 3. Learning and Theories of Learning. Definition, characteristics, and principles of learning. Definitions of learning. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior occurring as a result of experience or practice. Characteristics of learning. Learning is continuous modification of behavior throughout life. Learning is pervasive, it reaches into all aspects of human life. Learning involves the whole person, socially, emotionally and intellectually. Learning is often a change in the organization of experiences. Learning is responsive to incentives. Learning is an active process. Learning is purposeful. Learning depends on maturation, motivation, and practice. Learning is multifaceted. Factors influencing learning. Motivation. Maturation, a health condition. Psychological well-being, anxiety, fear, self-confidence, good working conditions. Theories of learning and their applications. There are 3 major theories of learning. 1. Behaviorist theory, Pavlov, Skinner, Thorndike. 2. Social learning, Albert Bandura. 3. Cognitive learning, Jean Piaget. Behavioral theory of learning. V. Learning from stimulus-response associations. VIT emphasizes observable behaviors. Think back the definition of psych. V. Focuses on consequences. V. Behaviorists differ on the role of reinforcement in learning. Thus, there are two major behavioral theories of learning. 1. Classical conditioning, formulated by Ivan Pavlov. 2. Operant conditioning, formulated Boris Frederick, B.F. Skinner. Classical conditioning theory. Classical conditioning focuses on the learning of involuntary emotional or physiological responses to stimuli that normally elicit no response, e.g. fear, increased heartbeat, salivation or sweating. Classical conditioning is a type of learning in which a neutral stimulus comes to bring about a response after it is paired with a stimulus that naturally brings about that response. Classical conditioning, continued. Basics of classical condition. 1. Neutral stimulus, a stimulus that, before conditioning, does not naturally bring about the response of interest. 2. Unconditioned stimulus, UCS, a stimulus that naturally brings about a particular response without having been learned. 3. Unconditioned response, UCR, a response that is natural and needs no training, example salivation at the smell of food. Basics. 4. Conditioned stimulus, CS, neutral stimulus that paired with an unconditioned stimulus to bring about a response similar with the unconditioned stimuli. 5. Conditioned response, CR, a response that follows a previously neutral stimulus. Classical conditioning, continued. Hence, the theory of classical conditioning represents a process in which a neutral stimulus, by pairing with a natural stimulus, acquires all the characteristics of natural stimulus. It is also called substitution learning. B/C. It involves substituting a neutral stimulus in place of natural stimulus. Let us consider Pavlov's experiment. Summary. Summary of classical conditioning procedure. A. Before conditioning food, UCS, salivation, UCR, bell, NS, no salivation. B. During conditioning, bell plus food, salivation, NS plus UCS, UCRC. After conditioning, bell, salivation, CSCR. Principles of classical condition. 1. Extinction, presenting the CS repeatedly without the UCS, meet, the CR will diminish and eventually stop. 2. Spontaneous recovery is the re-emergence of an extinguished, conditioned response after extinction. 3. Stimulus generalization is a process in which, after a stimulus has been conditioned to produce a particular response, stimuli that are similar to the original stimulus begin to produce the same responses. Stimulus generalization happens when an organism learns a response to one stimulus and applies it to another similar stimulus. Even though the stimuli may be different, the familiarity that accompanies the initial learning can be applied to other stimuli as well. Stimulus generalization enables organisms to take previous learning and apply it to new, but similar, situations. The ability to utilize previous learning keeps the organism from having to start over in the learning process. Generalizations can be less effective when the stimulus has an element of newness unassociated with the familiarity. For example, when a person learns to drive a car, this training can be generalized to driving most other cars. If the initial training was on an automatic transmission, though, and now the driver must drive a manual transmission, generalization of the prior skills is limited. The respondent must then use stimulus discrimination to distinguish between the familiar and the new information, and make the appropriate adjustments to generalize the new learning. Stimulus discrimination is the process of distinguishing two similar stimuli, the ability to differentiate between stimuli. Note that extinction would prove to be a useful psychological finding to treat phobias and other irrational fears. The following summary can help make the relationships between stimuli and responses easier to understand and remember. O conditioned equals learned. O unconditioned equals not learned. O an unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. O unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response pairings are unlearned and untrained. O during conditioning, a previously neutral stimulus is transformed into the conditioned stimulus. O a conditioned stimulus leads to a conditioned response, and a conditioned stimulus, conditioned response pairing is a consequence of learning and training. O an unconditioned response and a conditioned response are similar, such as salivation in Pavlov's experiment, but the unconditioned response occurs naturally, whereas the conditioned response is learned. Operant/instrumental conditioning. O operant conditioning, learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened or weakened, depending on its favorable or unfavorable consequences. O operant conditioning states that learning occurs as a result of the rewards and punishments the subject receives in response to a particular behavior. O if the result of the behavior is a reward, the same behavior is likely to be repeated. O if the result is a punishment, the behavior is less likely to be repeated. It states that learning occurs as a result of voluntary responses that are operating in the environment. These behavioral responses are either strengthened, more likely to recur, or weakened, less likely to recur, depending on whether the consequences of the response are favorable or unfavorable. Unlike classical conditioning, which depends on the biological responses, operant conditioning applies to voluntary responses, which an organism deliberately performs in order to achieve a desired outcome. When operant, a behavior operates on the environment in ways that produce consequences. Example: if a person is playing the piano, that person is operating on the environment, the keys on the piano, in such a way as to produce music. The quality of the music and comments from listeners are the consequences that condition the person's operant performance at the piano. Well-played music elicits social approval that reinforces the skills needed. Operant. O operant conditioning is learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened or weakened, depending on its favorable or unfavorable consequences. O it is a form of association learning in which the consequences of behavior produce changes in the probability of the behavior's occurrence. O also known as instrumental conditioning because it is instrumental in changing the environment and producing consequences. O in operant conditioning, the organism's response operates on the environment and the environment, in turn, operates the organism's response. Basic operations. As Skinner's analysis, a response, operant, can lead to three types of consequences: 1, a neutral consequence; 2, a reinforcement; or 3, punishment. 1. A neutral consequence that does not alter the response; 2. A reinforcement that strengthens the response by a reinforcer. Basic operations. 1. Reinforcement. A reinforcer is any event that increases the probability that the behavior that precedes it will be repeated. Reinforcers are the prime movers of operant conditioning. Reinforcers that follow an operant behavior increase the likelihood, reoccurrence, a similar response, behavior, in the future. There are two basic types of reinforcers. Primary reinforcers: food, water, light, stroking of the skin, and a comfortable air. Temperature. Secondary reinforcers: money, praise, applause, good grades, awards, and gold stars. Basic operations. Both primary and secondary reinforcers can be positive or negative. A positive reinforcement is the process whereby presentation of a stimulus makes behavior more likely to occur again. A positive reinforcer is a stimulus added to the environment that brings about an increase in a preceding response. For instance, if food, water, money, praise, or any number of other stimuli follow a particular response, it is very likely that this response will occur again in the future. A positive reinforcement can be given in natural or artificial ways. Natural praise and artificial rewards are not very effective in reinforcing behavior. Negative reinforcement is the process whereby elimination of an aversive stimulus makes behavior more likely to occur. A negative reinforcer refers to an unpleasant stimulus whose removal from the environment leads to an increase in the probability that a preceding response will occur again in the future. The two main classes of behavior produced by negative reinforcement are escape and avoidance. Escape responses are those operants that allow a person to get away from aversive stimuli after the stimuli are present. Avoidance responses are those operants that allow a person to prevent the occurrence of aversive stimuli before the aversive stimuli appear. In other words, escape involves reacting after an aversive event is present. Avoidance involves proacting or taking preventative steps before an aversive event arises. People react to getting a splinter in their finger by pulling it out, they proact by putting on gloves before handling rough wood. Escape behaviors are usually learned before avoidance behaviors. Examples. 1. For example, if someone nags you all the time to study, but stops nagging when you comply, your studying is likely to increase, e.g. escape learning, avoidance learning too. An example of escaping could involve a married couple who repeatedly find themselves in verbal arguments with each other. They react by trying to escape the aversive situation through marital counseling. 3. Other couples who see their friends having marital troubles may proact by working on improving their communication and resolving differences before problems arise, thereby avoiding some arguments and possible long-term damage to their marriage. Generally, better to understand as: there are two kinds of reinforcement, positive and negative. To reinforce means to strengthen, thus, both positive and negative reinforcement strengthen behavior, i.e., both increase the likelihood that a subject will repeat the behavior in the future. The critical difference between the two is that positive reinforcement occurs with the addition of a reinforcing stimulus. Negative reinforcement consists of removing an aversive stimulus. 2. Puniment. When an operant behavior is followed by a response that reduces the frequency of a similar response in the future, that stimulus is called punishment. If a person receives a significant fine after driving through a red light, the punishment is likely to reduce the tendency to speed through red lights in the future. Punishment produces the fastest reduction of the behavior when it is strong, immediate.